Welcome, comrades and friends. Global Weekly News, Series number 191. First item. Modi's visit to Israel, left in India condemns. Rallies were organized in different parts of India on 15th February to protest against the upcoming visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Israel as it continues its genocide in Gaza in complete violation of the ceasefire it agreed to in November 2025. Protesters under the banner of the Indian people in solidarity with the Palestinians demand that Modi cancel his visit and break all ties with Israel. They also express their solidarity with the Palestinian people. February 15 protests took place in New Delhi, Mumbai, Pune, Visakhapatnam, Vijayawada, Hyderabad, Patna and Kolkata. Protesters shouted slogans against the so-called Board of Peace on Gaza. In various places, protesters also burnt the effigies of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, calling him a war criminal. Second item, comrades. Indigenous community in Kenya face forced displacement. The Yaku indigenous people of Mukokoda Forest, a 30,000 hectare national forest reserves, are facing a major crisis in Africa. Between January 21 and 29, 2026, the Yaku community experienced repeated and escalating attacks by armed groups. On January 21st, over 1,200 livestock were stolen. On January 27, another 1,500 livestock were stolen. These events were condemned by the East African Indigenous Women-led Assembly. Kenyan security forces failed to provide meaningful protection to the Yaku community. On 3rd February, the Ministry of National Administration issued a 48-hour ultimatum ordering all people living in the forest to vacate. This is to favor the most powerful political and economic interests. Third item, comrades. Jesse Louis Jackson passes away. U.S. civil rights leader Jesse Louis Jackson passed away on 17th February. A towering figure in the struggle for black liberation. He worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and remained a steadfast advocate for civil rights and social justice for decades, even advocating for an end to U.S. sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela. Fourth item, longest blockade in Cuba. In 1453, Ottoman troops successfully blockaded the ancient Eastern Roman Empire. But not all blockades have worked. Most famous failure of a blockade in recent history is that of Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, which resisted the siege of the Nazi missionary from 1941 to 1944, 872 days in total. The siege of Leningrad caused the death by starvation and cold of over 10 lakh people, who, despite the cruelty of Hitler's troops, did not surrender the city until the USSR managed to counterattack and defeat the Third Reich. Without a doubt, Cuba has written a new chapter in the history of resistance to blockade. For more than 60 years, Cuba has managed to withstand a blockade. For decades, solidarity from the USSR, China, Vietnam, and other socialist countries managed to sustain a process supported by the vast majority of the Cuba's inhabitants. However, after the fall of USSR, Cuba faced an apparently catastrophic scenario. Clinton administration that time expected the end of the revolutionary government in Cuba. But Cuba resisted once again. Fidel Castro inaugurated the so-called special period during the 1990s. At the beginning of the 21st century, Chavez Venezuela supplied oil to Cuba. However, since December 2025, when the US imposed an oil blockade on Venezuela, and it has also threatened to impose special sanctions on any country that sells oil to Cuba. This is a measure that seeks to destroy Cuba. Trump is willing to drive Cuba to despair in order to bring down the Cuban government, the collapse of the only socialist government in America. Yet Cuba does not pose a military challenge that threatens US security. In 1861, thousands of US-based soldiers were defeated in the Bay of Pigs, where they invaded. They were defeated by the Cuban Revolutionary Army. Nevertheless, Cuba has never attacked the United States in any way. Nor is Cuba depriving its people of cultural, scientific, or sporting advances. Given that Cuba was the first country on the continent to eradicate illiteracy, it has become one of the countries with the most doctors per capita in the world, 1 doctor per 150 population. It has a much higher life expectancy, 78 to 79 years, than most other Latin American countries. And it is the second country with the most Olympic medals in the entire continent, next only to US. Fifth item, over 100 Cuban artists call for international solidarity. On 16th February, over 100 Cuban artists, intellectuals, dancers, musicians, and writers released a public letter calling on their colleagues from across the world to denounce the US attacks and stand firmly with Cuba. Sixth item, Iran condemns the US blockade of Cuba. Iran condemned the US blockade of Cuba, calling it a violation of all existing international laws and of the basic human rights of the Cuban people. Spokesperson of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs deplored the recent US actions to further strangle Cuba's economy and expressed its nation's solidarity with the Cuban people and its government. The Islamic Republic News Agency reported. Cuba almost completely depends on imported oil for its energy supplies. Last week, the United Nations expressed its concerns over the US-imposed energy crisis in Cuba. United Nations noted that Cuba's food, water supplies and health systems are at threat of shutting down due to lack of enough energy supplies, risking the lives of millions of its citizens. Intensive care units, delivery and storage of vaccines are affected. Russia, China, etc. have condemned the tightening of the US blockade on Cuba and demanded its immediate withdrawal. For the past 33 years, the United Nations General Assembly has voted almost unanimously to reject the US blockade on Cuba and demand the policy be ended. Still, United States, the so-called the cradle of democracy, is not bothered to listen to the voice of the global people. Seventh item, comrades. Mexico's solidarity with Cuba. Cuban ambassador to Mexico, Martinez, spoke at a solidarity rally at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City on 15th February to thank Mexican activists and affirm the resilience of the Cuban people. In addition to the shipment of humanitarian aid by the Mexican government of Claudia Sheinbaum, solidarity groups in Mexico have been organizing donation drives and fundraising efforts to send food and medicine to the island as it faces an acute crisis. Eighth item, comrades. Europe urged to embrace colonial legacy. At the 2026 Munich Security Conference, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio urged Europe to embrace the colonial legacy as part of a unified Western civilization to protect global dominance. He framed challenges like climate activism, migration, and deindustrialization as threats to Western ways of life and emphasized the revival of Western power. In their addresses at the Munich conference, everyone from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz referred to this increased military spending, the building of new armies. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, spoke in the conference. We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are defending a great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history, confident of its future, and aims to always be the master of its own economic and political destiny. For 5 centuries before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, settled in new continents, built vast empires, extending out across the globe. The West should also no longer place the so-called global order above the vital interests of our people and our nations. Well, this is what Marco Rubio said. Our people means US people and our nations, Western nations. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, on the contrary, emphasized the importance of international mechanisms built through global cooperation. China will be a staunch force for peace. We will commit to the path of peaceful development. That's what Wang Yi, Chinese Foreign Minister, said. Outside the conference, thousands of people, trade union activists, youth groups, members of left and progressive parties demonstrated against the agenda advanced by the US and its European partners. They called for an end to the US assaults on Cuba, Venezuela, and other Latin American countries. True peace and sovereignty for the people of Palestine. And a Europe free of compulsory army service and wars. Ninth item. US Senator calls for US military intervention in Iran. US Senator Lindsey Graham addressed a pro-war rally outside the Munich Security Conference, calling for the United States to take military action against Iran and for a return of the Iranian monarchy. Graham declared, "This is a moment I have been dreaming of, a free Iran." 10th item. Mali stands with Cuba. Anti-imperialist activists and former students of Mali who studied in Cuba rallied at the Cuban embassy in Bamako, Mali's capital, to express their solidarity with Cuba as it faces press attacks from Trump administration. 11th item, comrades. British court judgment. The ban on direct action group Palestine Action by Keir Starmer's government of Britain was ruled unlawful on 13th February, another major breakthrough for the Palestine Solidarity Movement. In July 2025, then Home Secretary designated Palestine Action a terrorist organization. However, the move backfired, with thousands joining peaceful sit-ins, holding signs reading, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." Over 2,500 people were arrested during these actions. There is no longer any reason for Palestine Action-linked prisoners, including those who went on hunger strike, to be held in prison without trial on the unsubstantiated terror charges. They should be released immediately. 12th item, Javier Milei's neoliberal reform advances. Argentina, South American country, Argentina's far-right president Javier Milei is accelerating his neoliberal agenda. He said in an official statement that the reform represents a turning point in Argentina's history. Governor of the province of Buenos Aires said during the massive demonstrations against the reform, if severance pay, if the terminal benefits, overtime and vacation time, everything that has been won over time are put at risk, it will not improve the situation of any worker. Left-wing congressman affirmed the labor reform does not create jobs or benefit any worker. It is a slave-like labor reform. He also called on workers to organize a major national strike. On 12th February, the Argentine Senate approved Milei's labor reform with 42 votes in favor and 30 against. The reform will allow the working day to be increased to 12 hours. Now companies will deduct 1 to 2.5% of workers' salaries for the labor assistance fund, which will cover the costs of layoffs. The reform aims directly at weakening the power of trade unions, which have played a historic role in defending the rights in Argentina. For example, agreements within each company will now take precedence over collective sector-level agreements. So this will take away the collective bargaining rights to a certain extent. The right to strike also threatened, as unions will now have to guarantee 75% of operations in essential services such as health, education, energy, transportation and water, and 50% in the case of banks, mining, industry and e-commerce. The demonstrations were heavily repressed by the police. At least 71 people were arrested. Lastly, comrades, Venezuela denies media report. US news agency Bloomberg published a report on 10th February that Venezuela was sending Israel a shipment of crude oil for the first time in years. Venezuela's sectoral vice president for communications and culture branded this news as fake news. Latin American news network Telesur reaffirmed that Venezuela officially cut off its diplomatic relations with Israel in 2009 when Israel occupied Palestine. Such disinformation campaigns aim at shaking public confidence in Venezuela's acting interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, destabilizing the country and distorting its international image. Thank you, comrades. Lal Salam.